I spent over 100 hours creating the 42-page blueprint for the Blackwood Estates gardens. It was a complete ecosystem, a work of art. I lost the bid, of course, and a month later I watched from the street as my competitor, David, directed his crew, pointing to a laminated copy of my design and telling them exactly where to plant my vision. He didn't even have the decency to redraw it in his own hand. The watermark of my small, one-woman business, Terraflora Designs, was still faintly visible in the bottom corner of every single page. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of my own making. I should have watermarked it right across the middle. Hindsight is a cruel beast. For 2 months, I'd poured every ounce of my soul into that proposal. The Blackwoods, a power couple with new money and an old name to build, wanted more than just a pretty yard. They wanted a statement. They wanted sustainable, ecological, and bespoke. Those were the buzzwords they used, anyway. I gave them a sanctuary. I designed a native pollinator garden that would evolve with the seasons, a rainwater harvesting system that looked like a natural creek bed, and a series of interconnected microclimates that would support everything from shade-loving ferns to sun-drenched alpine flowers. It was the project that was supposed to put me on the map, the one that would finally let me quit my part-time bartending gig. I'd met David at the initial bidders conference. He was exactly the type you'd expect, 50-something, polo shirt stretched tight over a paunch, a handshake like a dead fish, and an air of smug entitlement that probably followed him into the bathroom. His company, Green King Landscaping, was the old guard. They did McMansion lawns, cookie-cutter boxwood hedges, and soulless patios. His proposal, from what I overheard, involved a lot of turf and thirsty, non-native ornamentals. It was the opposite of what the Blackwoods claimed to want. But he had 2 decades of business and a fleet of shiny trucks. I had a beat-up pickup and a portfolio of smaller, more thoughtful projects. The final presentation was my chance. I walked the Blackwoods through every detail, my passion evident in every word. I explained how the bee balm and the cannef flowers would not only look stunning but would also support the local bee population. I showed them renderings of the dry creek bed, explaining how it would mitigate runoff and prevent erosion on their sloped property. Mrs. Blackwood, a woman whose face was pulled so tight it looked like a porcelain mask, seemed genuinely impressed. Mr. Blackwood just nodded, his eyes fixed on the projected budget. Then David presented. He was slick, full of corporate jargon and empty promises. He talked about premium aesthetics and luxury outdoor living. He showed them pictures of other, grander estates his company had done. I knew my design was better, more aligned with their stated goals. But I also knew how the world worked. A week later, I got the email. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with another firm. It was sterile, dismissive. No feedback, no thank you for your extensive work. Just a door slammed in my face. The real gut punch came when I saw his trucks parked outside the Blackwood estate a few weeks later. I was driving home from a consultation for a small backyard patio, the kind of job that paid the bills but didn't feed the soul. Curiosity, that masochistic impulse, made me pull over. And there he was, David, strolling around the graded earth like he was a king surveying his domain. And in his hand, those laminated pages. My pages. My layout, my plant choices, my intricate irrigation plan. He was building my garden. He hadn't just beaten me, he had stolen the very heart of my work. He'd lowballed me on the bid, knowing he could do it for less because he didn't have to pay for the 100+ hours of intellectual labor that went into the design. He just had to steal it. Rage, pure and hot, flooded my veins. I parked my truck, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, and marched right up to the property line. David. He turned, a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by a condescending smirk. Sarah, isn't it? To what do I owe the pleasure? That's my design, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I pointed at the papers in his hand. That is my intellectual property. He laughed. A short, barking sound. It's a garden plan, sweetheart. Dirt, flowers. You can't own that. The Blackwoods chose the superior company, that's all. We're just giving them what they want. They wanted my design, I shot back. You stole it. Prove it, he said, his eyes glinting with malice. You submitted it as part of a bid. Once it's in the client's hands, it's their call. Maybe you should have thought of that. My fists were clenched so tight my nails were digging into my palms. Just then, Mrs. Blackwood emerged from the house, gliding across the torn-up lawn in a pair of pristine white sneakers. Is there a problem here? She asked, her voice as crisp and cold as a winter morning. I turned to her, my last hope. Mrs. Blackwood, this is my design. David's company stole my plans. The ones I spent weeks creating for you. Look at the watermark. She glanced dismissively at the papers in David's hand, then back at me. Her eyes traveled down my dusty work boots and faded jeans, then over to David's branded polo shirt and clean chinos. It was a judgment, swift and final. We made our choice based on experience and reputation, she said, the words clipped. We have a contract with Green King. I'm afraid this is a private matter between you and them. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a schedule to maintain. And with that, she turned her back on me. The dismissal was absolute. I was nothing. A fly to be swatted away. David just stood there, that triumphant, greasy smile plastered on his face. I was defeated. Utterly and completely humiliated. As I walked back to my truck, the sounds of his crew starting their machinery grinding in my ears, a different feeling began to bubble up through the rage and despair. It was a cold, quiet resolve. They wanted my garden? Fine. They were going to get it. But nature is a patient, powerful thing, and I knew all its dirtiest little secrets. My vision was about to become their nightmare. For the first few days, I just stewed. I'd sit in my small apartment, surrounded by horticulture textbooks and sketches for other, smaller projects, and just let the anger burn. I imagined all the typical revenge fantasies, teeing David's shiny trucks, posting scathing online reviews, filing the lawsuit I knew I couldn't afford and would probably lose. But none of it felt right. It was too direct, too crude. It wasn't elegant. David and the Blackwoods had treated my work, my art, like a cheap commodity. The revenge, I decided, had to be as intricate and alive as the garden they had stolen. My plan began to form where all my best ideas did, in the aisles of my favorite local nursery, a sprawling place run by a woman who knew more about botany than anyone I'd ever met. As I ran my fingers over the leaves of a particularly aggressive variety of trumpet vine, an idea, wicked and wonderful, took root. David was a fraud. He knew how to install a landscape, but he didn't understand it. He didn't understand the complex, often brutal, dance of an ecosystem. He saw plants as static objects to be placed according to a diagram. He didn't see them as living things with their own agendas, their own relentless drive to survive and conquer. I, on the other hand, did. The first step was reconnaissance. The Blackwoods estate was on the edge of a wealthy, semi-rural subdivision. It was easy enough for me to rent a small cottage about a mile away, a place I could use as a staging ground. The cover story was simple. I was a freelance writer on a nature retreat, seeking peace and quiet. The neighborhood was full of people who kept to themselves, so a new, quiet neighbor wouldn't raise any alarms. From there, I started taking long, leisurely walks, my friendly golden retriever, Buster, trotting at my side. Naturally, my route took me right past the Blackwood property. I watched them work for weeks. David's crew was fast and efficient, I'll give them that. They laid the stone for the patios I had designed, dug the meandering creek bed, and installed the expensive irrigation system exactly to my specifications. It was like watching a movie of my own dream, but with a villain cast in the lead role. Every perfectly placed river stone, every gracefully curving path, was a fresh stab in my gut. David would show up for an hour or so each day, bark orders, and leave. He never once got his hands dirty. My moment came on a sunny Saturday afternoon. I saw Mrs. Blackwood outside, directing the placement of some large ceramic planters near the front door. It was time to become the helpful, knowledgeable new neighbor. With Buster as my social lubricant, I ambled up the long driveway. "Excuse me," I said, putting on my friendliest, most non-threatening voice. "I am so sorry to bother you. I'm new to the neighborhood, just moved into the cottage down the road. I just had to say, your garden is going to be absolutely spectacular." Mrs. Blackwood, whose name I learned was Alina, turned. Her face was still a mask of taut perfection, but she seemed to soften slightly at the sight of Buster wagging his tail. "Oh, thank you," she said. "We're very excited. It's been a long process." "I can imagine," I said, gesturing vaguely at the landscape. "A project this ambitious takes real vision. I'm Sarah, by the way." I offered a hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly firm. "Eleanor, it's a pleasure." We made small talk for a few minutes. I told her about my writing retreat, and she complained about the dust and the noise. All the while, my eyes were scanning. I saw the soil they were using: cheap, nutrient-poor topsoil, probably what David got in bulk. A fatal flaw. My design had called for a custom blend of compost and loam to support the delicate native perennials. David had cut a corner. It was the first of many, I was sure. This was my opening. "You know," I said, feigning a sudden thought, "I actually have a bit of a green thumb myself. I have this absolutely gorgeous plant that would look stunning in those planters. It's a type of morning glory, with the most incredible blue flowers. It's a bit of a passion project of mine. I grow them from heirloom seeds. I'd be happy to give you a few seedlings as a welcome to the neighborhood gift from me." Eleanor's eyes lit up. A free, heirloom plant? It appealed directly to her sense of status. "Why, that's incredibly generous of you, Sarah." "It's no trouble at all. I'll drop them by tomorrow." The plant I brought her was, of course, Ipomoea purpurea, common morning glory. To the untrained eye, it's beautiful. Its trumpet-shaped flowers are a dazzling shade of sky blue. But any seasoned gardener knows its dark secret. It's an aggressive, invasive self-seeder. Its vines will crawl over everything, choking out any plant in its path. And once it takes hold, it is notoriously, almost biblically, difficult to eradicate. Its seeds can lie dormant in the soil for years. It was the perfect Trojan horse. A week later, I came bearing another gift. This time, I found Mr. Blackwood, Richard, struggling with a patch of bare earth near the foundation of the house. "Having some trouble there?" I asked with a smile. "Damn builders left this whole section a mess," he grumbled. "The landscaper says the soil is too compacted for anything to grow." "Ah, compacted clay. A classic problem," I said, oozing sympathy and expertise. "You need something with a really robust root system to break that up. Something that thrives in tough conditions." I paused, as if thinking hard. "I have just the thing. A friend gave me some Japanese knotweed cuttings. It's amazing. It has these lovely white flowers and it grows so fast. It'll fill this in for you in no time. It's practically indestructible." Richard was sold on indestructible. What I didn't tell him was that Japanese knotweed is the botanical equivalent of a horror movie monster. Its roots, or rhizomes, can grow through concrete, asphalt, and housing foundations. It can regenerate from a tiny fragment of its root. In the UK, you can be prosecuted for not controlling its spread. It's one of the most invasive and destructive plants on the planet. I gave him 3 small, innocent-looking cuttings in a pot. It was like handing someone a lit stick of dynamite. My final gift for the opening salvo was for the beautiful, shady area under a cluster of mature oak trees, a spot I had designed for a delicate carpet of native mosses and ferns. I found a leaner there one afternoon, looking perplexed. Mr. Connors said the shade here is too deep, she said, using David's last name with a hint of irritation. He said nothing but hostas will grow, and I think hostas are so common. Oh, he's wrong, I said with a confident laugh. You just need the right ground cover. I have some bishop's weed I can share. It has this lovely, variegated leaf and it spreads to create a beautiful, dense mat. It's perfect for keeping weeds down in a shady spot. She was delighted. Bishop's weed, or goutweed, is another nightmare plant. It spreads via aggressive underground rhizomes, forming a dense monoculture that eradicates all other plant life. It's a green cancer for a garden. Ripping it out only creates more plants from the broken root fragments. I had planted my seeds, both literally and figuratively. I was their friendly, helpful neighbor, the sweet writer with a knack for gardening. They had no idea they had just invited the architect of their own beautiful, green destruction right into their prize-winning garden. I'd watch David's crew finish their work over the next couple of weeks, laying down sod, planting the last of the expensive perennials I had so carefully chosen. It was all so perfect, so pristine. But I knew what was lurking just beneath the surface, coiled and waiting. The season was changing. Spring was giving way to the heat of summer, and my poison garden was just starting to wake up. Summer arrived with a vengeance, blanketing the region in a thick, humid heat that made everything grow with an almost desperate urgency. My garden, the one David had put his name on, was no exception. At first, things looked exactly as they should. The Blackwood's new landscape was the talk of the neighborhood. Cars would slow down as they passed, their occupants admiring the artful arrangement of ornamental grasses and the vibrant splashes of color from the echinacea and black-eyed Susans, all my choices, all part of my stolen plan. The Blackwoods hosted lavish garden parties on the patio I had designed, the soft glow of the landscape lighting I had specified illuminating their smug, happy faces. David was riding high. He put a huge sign for Green King Landscaping right at the end of the driveway and even had a photographer out to take pictures for his portfolio. I saw him there once, pointing out features to the photographer, taking credit for the subtle grade of the lawn that allowed for perfect drainage, for the placement of a Japanese maple that would frame the sunset. My blood boiled, but I forced a serene smile as I walked past with Buster. Patience. Botany is a game of patience. I continued my friendly neighbor routine, stopping to chat with Alina whenever I saw her. The morning glories were the first to reveal their true nature. Your seedlings are just marvelous, Sarah, she gushed one morning, pointing to the planters by her door. The vines had exploded, covering the ceramic pots and starting to snake their way up the columns of the portico, their blue flowers a cheerful, deceptive greeting. They're so vigorous. They just love the sun, I said, smiling sweetly. Just be sure to snip off the dead flowers, or they'll go to seed everywhere. It was advice I knew she'd be too busy or too disinterested to follow. By mid-July, the everywhere had begun. Tiny morning glory seedlings were popping up in the pristine flower beds nearby. Her regular gardening crew, a couple of guys from David's company who came once a week to mow and weed, would pull them out, but for every one they pulled, 10 more seemed to sprout. The vines on the columns were now thick and woody, their tendrils starting to pry at the edges of the window frames. Meanwhile, in the back, the bishop's weed was living up to its reputation. The lovely, dense mat had become a sprawling, aggressive carpet. It had already completely smothered the delicate, expensive ferns I had planned for that shady spot. Now it was making a break for the sun, sending out underground runners into the main lawn. Little white and green leaves were starting to appear in the middle of the perfect, emerald green turf. But the real monster, my ace in the hole, was the Japanese knotweed. For the first month, it didn't do much. Then, it took hold. The three small cuttings grew into a dense, 6 foot tall thicket of bamboo like stalks. It had completely filled the problem area Richard had complained about, just as I'd promised. It had also started to send up shoots through the gravel path that ran alongside the house. And then, one morning, I saw it, a pale, determined green shoot, pushing its way up through a hairline crack in the foundation of their brand new, multi-million-dollar home. I felt a jolt, a terrifying thrill. This was moving beyond petty revenge. This was becoming something else entirely. The phone calls to David must have started around then. I saw his truck at the property more and more often. He no longer looked smug and relaxed. He looked stressed, angry. I watched from a distance as he argued with his foreman, gesturing wildly at the creeping, crawling chaos that was steadily undoing his masterpiece. They sprayed herbicide, but it only seemed to anger the weeds, which would die back for a week before reemerging stronger than ever. They tried digging out the knotweed, but I knew that was a fool's errand. They were just chopping up the rhizomes, creating hundreds of new potential plants. My lowest point came unexpectedly. I was in the local grocery store, picking up some milk, when I overheard two women talking in the next aisle. I recognized one of them as a neighbor of the Blackwoods. Total disaster, the woman was saying. Eleanor is beside herself. She said they paid a fortune for that landscaping, and it's being completely overrun. She says the guy, David Connors, is a total incompetent. Apparently, the weeds are even breaking their patio. My heart skipped a beat. Breaking the patio? I hadn't counted on that. She's threatening to sue him, the other woman said. Not just to get her money back, but for damages. She thinks the foundation of the house might be compromised. A cold dread washed over me. A lawsuit. That meant depositions, investigations. Landscaping experts would be called in. They would identify the plants. They would ask where they came from. The Blackwoods were wealthy and litigious. They'd want to know who was responsible for introducing these monsters onto their property. And Eleanor, for all her snobbery, wasn't stupid. How many people had given her welcome to the neighborhood plants? Just one. Me, the friendly rider from the cottage down the road. The failed bidder. The woman with a clear motive. I felt the walls of the grocery aisle closing in. My clever, botanical revenge suddenly felt reckless and stupid. I had wanted to ruin David's reputation, not get sued into oblivion myself. I had pictured a quiet, satisfying victory, not a messy, public court battle that could expose me as a malicious saboteur. I fled the store, my groceries forgotten. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck. I had set a fire, and now it was threatening to burn me, too. The garden was spiraling out of control, and for the first time, so was my plan. The triumphant closure I had envisioned was dissolving, replaced by a terrifying, unknown future where I wasn't the clever hero of my own story, but the villain in someone else's. The last few weeks of summer were a masterclass in anxiety. Every time a car slowed down on my street, I was convinced it was a lawyer's process server. I jumped every time the phone rang. I stopped my walks past the Blackwood estate, terrified that Eleanor would see me and the cogs would start turning in her perfectly coiffed head. My beautiful, righteous anger had curdled into a constant, low-grade fear. I had won, but it felt sickeningly like I had lost. The garden, my stolen masterpiece, was now a monument to my own potential ruin. From what I could gather through the local grapevine, which in a neighborhood like that was as efficient as a telegraph, the situation at the Blackwood house had escalated dramatically. The morning glory vines had pulled gutters away from the roofline and had shattered a window pane in their relentless quest for sun. The bishop's weed had completely infiltrated the lawn, turning the perfect green expanse into a patchy, variegated mess. But the knotweed was the star of the show. It had buckled a section of the bluestone patio, creating a dangerous trip hazard, and the chute by the foundation was now a thick, woody cane, one of many that were now exploiting every microscopic weakness in the concrete. The Blackwoods had hired a structural engineer. The breaking point finally came on a blistering hot afternoon in early September. I was loading some tools into my truck when I saw David's Green King pickup barrel down the road and screech to a halt in front of the Blackwoods driveway. A few minutes later, the Blackwoods' sleek black Mercedes followed. Something was happening. Against my better judgment, I got in my truck and drove slowly down the street, parking at a spot that gave me a clear, if distant, view of the front yard. It was a full-blown showdown. Richard and a leaner Blackwood were standing on what was left of their lawn, their faces masks of pure fury. David stood opposite them, his arms crossed, his usual smugness replaced by a desperate, defensive posture. Even from a distance, I could hear their raised voices carrying on the still air. Eleanor was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at David. "This is a catastrophe. An unmitigated disaster. You call yourself a professional?" "We are doing everything we can," David shouted back, his voice cracking. "This is an unprecedented infestation. It's not our fault." "Not your fault," Richard bellowed. "We paid you over $200,000 for a premium, low-maintenance landscape. We have weeds growing through our foundation. Our patio is ruined. Who is at fault, if not you?" "The soil must have been contaminated," David pleaded, grasping at straws. "This doesn't just happen." "Oh, it doesn't just happen?" Eleanor's voice dripped with ice. "Our last landscaper, the young woman, the one with the original ideas, I bet this wouldn't have happened with her. You know, we should have listened to our gut. We went with the bigger name, and we got a bigger disaster. You are a fraud, Mr. Connors." That word fraud seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. "You're fired, obviously," Richard said flatly. "And you'll be hearing from our lawyer. We want a full refund, plus damages. I suggest you get your sign off my property. Now." David stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. Defeated. He looked small and pathetic. He slowly walked over to the Green King landscaping sign, the symbol of his stolen victory, and wrestled it from the ground. He heaved it into the back of his truck without looking back, got in, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I had been holding. A wave of profound, dizzying relief washed over me. They blamed him. They blamed him completely. My name hadn't come up. My cleverness hadn't been in giving them the plants, but in making them believe the problem was his incompetence. He had cut corners on the soil, on the prep work. He didn't know the ecosystem he was working with. When the invasive species I introduced took root in that poor soil, it looked not like sabotage, but like the inevitable result of his own shoddy work. His reputation, far more valuable than any single contract, was in shreds. I never found out if they actually sued him or if they settled. A few weeks later, a new set of trucks were parked outside the estate. They belonged to an environmental remediation company. Men in hazmat-style suits were systematically digging up huge sections of the garden, treating the soil, and tenting the foundation. The cost must have been astronomical. My poison garden was being dismantled piece by painful piece. I moved out of the cottage at the end of the month. My work there was done. The experience, as terrifying as it had been, had changed me. The anger was gone, replaced by a harder, more resilient sense of self-worth. I had trusted the system, and it had failed me. So I had trusted myself and my knowledge, and I had prevailed. Was it right? I don't know, but it felt like justice. A few months later, I got a call. It was from a wealthy couple who lived 2 towns over. They'd heard about the Blackwood disaster. They told me they were looking for a landscape designer who truly understood ecology, someone who knew how to work with nature, not just impose a design upon it. Someone who could create a beautiful, resilient, and truly sustainable garden. They had gotten my name from the owner of my favorite nursery. They had a massive property, a blank canvas, and an almost unlimited budget. It was the kind of project I had only dreamed of, a career defining contract. As the client described his vision, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, I guess, you just have to tear down the old garden to make space for a new one to grow. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. We appreciate everyone and can't wait to bring more stories your way.